Greetings, everyone. It's Miss Solomon here, and in this video series, we are hopping from Canto to Canto to see how the contents of Dante's Inferno can inspire further conversation in our contemporary moment about various topics in philosophy, psychology, and religion. We have arrived at one of my personal favorite circles of hell that houses the carnal or the lustful. The tone of Canto 5 shifts from the intellectual restraint of limbo to this absolute turbulence of passion. The canto here that we've arrived to, number 5, is really emotionally charged, and it offers a rich site for discussion of the specific contrapasso of this circle, the psychology of it all, and the ethics of empathy on the whole, especially with one particular scene. So, leaving limbo's luminous stillness from Canto 4, Dante the Pilgrim and Virgil descend into this second circle of hell where Minos, the infernal judge, coils his tail to assign each soul its place. So it's like a sorting of sorts. On page 940 of your book, if you have it open, starting at line 4, read along with me to witness this sorting ritual. Here in the second circle of hell. There Minos sits, grinning, grotesque, and hale. He examines each lost soul as it arrives and delivers his verdict with his coiling tail. That is to say, when the ill-fated soul appears before him, it confesses all, and that grim sorter of the dark and foul decides which place in hell shall be its end. Then wraps his twitching tail around himself, one coil for each degree, it must descend. It meaning the soul. So no longer a personhood assigned to these souls. The soul descends and others take its place. Each crowds in its turn to judgment. Each confesses. Each hears its doom and falls away through space. Mercy. It's beautiful poetry. But a horrific scene. It's this grotesque parody of justice, right? Like straight up parody. And it's awful. But it shows how divine order becomes monstrous when filtered through sin, at least in Dante's depiction and his articulation of his theology at the time. So Minos is mechanical and instinctual. He's not deliberative or calculating. Like there's no Excel spreadsheet, and there's no rubric, and there's no objective mechanisms to make sure that everybody goes exactly where they belong, and that in itself is kind of monstrous. And Minos makes his decision very impulsively, and that impulse mirrors the kind that lust illustrates, because lust is also incredibly instinctive, incredibly impulsive, just like this sorting process. How could this mockery of judgment that we just saw spark other conversations in other disciplines? So Meno represents this perversion of reason or logos into just straight up appetite. Reason no longer governs judgment here in the second circle of hell. Desire dictates it. So I think we've left reason behind altogether, and we are at the whims of desire. The tail that coils around Minos's body externalizes the image of repressed instinct dominating the psyche. It's like the image of the libido or the sex drive turned punitive. And this mock judge of sorts reminds us that sin judges itself. The damned have already chosen their fate through the habits of their desires, and that same kind of impulsivity is again going to be a part of that choice, whether or not we have didactic inclusion into what that choice is. It's kind of like a natural consequence of such unbridled desire. So, moving on, Dante the Pilgrim witnesses how the souls in Circle 2 for the lustful are punished for eternity. He sees it with his own eyes. These lustful souls are swept forever by a black, howling wind, and they are denied the peace and stability of reason. So on page 941, starting at line 28, read along with me to see how Dante the poet and the pilgrim, as he speaks, articulates the punishment for the lustful. I came to a place stripped bare of every lot, and roaring on the naked dark like seas racked by a war of winds. Their hellish flight of storm and counterstorm through time foregone sweeps the souls of the damned before its charge. Whirling and battering, it drives them on, and when they pass the ruined gap of hell through which we had come, their shrieks begin anew. There they blaspheme the power of God eternal. And this I learned was the never ending flight of those who sinned in the flesh, the carnal and lusty who betrayed reason to their appetite. Skip down to line 43. Here, there, up, down, they whirl and whirling strain with with never a hope of hope to comfort them. Gosh, doesn't that resonate? Never a hope of hope to comfort them. Not of release, but even of less pain. So herein lies the contrapasso for the lustful in Circle 2. In life, their passions ruled them like a tempest, or a storm, or a wave. In death, they are condemned to enact that storm endlessly and forever. This allegorical punishment for the carnal could lead us to think in a number of other avenues. So, first, the sin of lust here is not condemned for sensual pleasure, but for the lack of measure or temperantia. It's the Aristotelian vice of excess. That's when really the way that Aristotle would define this excess is its appetite that governs over the rational virtue, and they're just two completely separate entities. It's just the appetite goes, and there's no thought, reason, process behind it, no rationality, just carnal. The storm psychologically represents emotional chaos big time. You see, these souls have the inability to hold steady in its attachments, and likely was that way in life. The lovers are literally swept away by passion, as people are often when they are obsessed or addicted or under similar circumstances of this emotional chaos. And then lastly, for religion, Dante the poet will say this, and I think that there are a number of ways that this can apply or create some really cool conversation today, is that lust distorts love, which love in the end is the thing. Love is the thing for the entire Divine Comedy. And if lust distorts love, then one cannot be led toward the divine. And that's kind of the some of the big picture that I hope that folks learn through their study of Dante Alighieri's epic poetry. This punishment of the whirling and the constant storm that they're swept up in, it inverts divine movement. So instead of ascent toward the beloved or God, they spiral endlessly downward in a desire that's left ultimately unfulfilled. Back to the plot. In this circle of hell, there are also several names we may find familiar from our studies in this class, as well as your own lives elsewhere, if there's some of these names on the screen that you recognize. You may skim through page 942 for reference if you'd like to take some notes. So, first, kind of later on, but it's the first on the list, we have Tristan, who is a complicated figure in literary history, but he can essentially be seen as a folk hero who has a tumultuous affair with a woman named Iseult. We will also see Dido, who is the Queen of Carthage and the love interest in Virgil's The Aeneid. And Dido kills herself when Aeneas abandons her for war. And of course, there are some gods and um, some Cupid and some arrows, and it's all a big mess. But eventually, she falls on a sword and kills herself for love in an obsessed way. And then we have Cleopatra, whose reputation in part is due to her power, her beauty, and seduction of very famous male figures in history. The last three on our slide here all come from our reading of the Iliad by Homer. I think we could theoretically have like a really robust discussion about why Helen, Achilles, and Paris would land here in hell among the lustful. And I encourage you to do take some time to wrestle with that idea and think through this for yourselves. Maybe to us this isn't where we would put them, and I wonder if any of them even really deserve to be here. But remember as well, this is the Middle Ages. There's hardly room for any sorts of playtime, and we are a culture in transition whenever Christianity is being centralized even more in a hemisphere where classic antiquity and those principles would have ruled. Medieval folks were not as forgiving and magnanimous as the ancients were, and really, I think maybe the way that we can be today, considering where you are positioned and what your background and perspective is. And so now we have arrived at an absolutely iconic scene. If there are any fans of Hosier's music, then you may have a frame of reference for the characters in this episode. Among the storm-tossed souls in this second circle of hell, Dante the Pilgrim sees Francesca da Rimini as well as Paolo Malatesta, whose adulterous love was exposed and punished by Francesca's husband, who just so happens to also be Paleo's brother. Big time romance, drama, all that. So Dante the Pilgrim is surprisingly emotionally stricken by the sight of these lovers in hell. And it's going to be a test of his empathy, and he's really starting to work through this journey for himself. This is his next stage. And so if you're on page sorry about that. If you are on page 943 at the bottom, Dante says this, Francesca, What you suffer here melts me to tears of pity and pain. Go ahead and turn the page. But tell me, in the time of your sweet sighs, by what appearances found love the way to lure you to this perilous paradise? Francesca's voice in response is very lyrical, measured, and almost saintly. So on page 944, starting at line 118, Francesca, responds with these next several stanzas. The double grief of a lost bliss is to recall its happy hour in pain. Your God and teacher knows the truth of this. But if there is indeed a soul in hell to ask of the beginning of our love out of his pity, I will weep and tell. So she's kissing and telling now. On a day for dalliance, we read the rhyme of Lancelot from Arthurian legends. How love had mastered him. We were alone with innocence in dim time. Ooh, I love that translation, dim time. Pause after pause, that high old story drew our eyes together while we blushed and paled. But it was one soft passage overthrew our caution and our hearts. For when we read how her fond smile was kissed by such a lover, he who is one with me, alive and dead, breathed on my lips the tremor of his kiss. That book, and he who wrote it, was a pander. That day, we read no further. So it's even seductive, the way that she tells her own story and is not denying whatsoever the passion, and even insinuates they didn't read anymore. They were doing other stuff. So essentially, Francesca and Paolo fell in love while reading the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, and she outwardly blames the book and that moment of shared reading for their fall in a sorts. This story and reasoning affected Dante the Pilgrim so much that he fell, quote, fell as a corpse might fall to the dead floor of hell, as the text says. Bless his heart. Poor Dante. I think he's gearing up, trying to get stronger, but he faints again. Poor guy. And so Francesca's beautiful words justify these destructive feelings, and they latch on to Dante, who, in a sense, has a lot to work through here because he is on this divinely called journey in part by the love of his life, which is Beatrice. And so he has to reconcile those two things, and that's a lot to reconcile. And so Dante the Pilgrim's his I guess it's good. His reaction is to just faint and think about it later. I don't know, so he can process it somehow. But we do have a lot to unpack here when it comes to this scene with Francesca and Paolo. So let's get into it as we do. So Francesca's rhetoric of inevitability in her response, it echoes courtly love and the ideology of courtly love. It's where passion is fate and it's beyond our moral control. Dante exposes in this scene how romantic idealization can mask moral failure. Next, in psychology, Francesca's explanation is kind of a projection and rationalization in poetic form. So, if you are a psychology person, you're well acquainted with these terms of projection and rationalization. Francesca reframes her adultery as destiny and avoids the agency. Yet her eloquence in reciting how everything went down draws both Dante and I think us into complicity because we become empathetic And it's this also what's called an empathic contagion. So while, they, according to the laws of the time and even some of your laws now, we've got adultery here. And some folks may think that it's not as punishable or that it's awful, and that's all up to your interpretations. But we are looking at Dante and his theology and seeing how that can further um, inspire some discussion here. It's when we feel bad for them, even though they have committed a great sin of adultery, it's complicated. It's complicated. And there is that specific name for it. You have the empathic contagion that laces into the moral disorder. And then lastly, with religion, Dante weeps for them. He feels awful for them. But Virgil reminds him that pity for the damned is itself a sin. And Virgil is learning this, occupying hell, and kind of getting the scoop. So we can do with that as we will, and chew on that for a little while and see what kind of philosophical thought that can brew for you. The challenge for us and for the folks who would have been reading this, and I think even for Dante the poet and Dante the pilgrim as a character, is to feel compassion without losing moral clarity. So, Canto 5 marks Dante's first encounter with the tragic beauty of sin. It's the point in the text where ethics meets aesthetics. I personally admire how Canto 5 treats the seductive power of language. Like that part that I read that was Francesca's, that's gorgeous. Her poetic eloquence mirrors Ovid and his erotic style, and it turns beauty into a veil for sin. Dante the Pilgrim succumbs to this empathy, and Dante the poet disciplines it into structure. Dante the Pilgrim's fainting at the canto's close here echoes an earlier collapse at the Acheron, but it's a different reason that he faints. Now, Dante the Pilgrim is overwhelmed by pity, not by fear like he was last time. So he's growing a little bit, learning more lessons, getting a little stronger, getting a little bit more clarity on his walk through faith. The collapse here in the second circle of hell signals the poet's struggle to discipline compassion into wisdom. Mercy sakes, it is so hard to do, and it's one of the many reasons why I admire this canto. And in many ways, that is the central task of the entire Divine Comedy. The Inferno being just one part of it, is going through that struggle of disciplining compassion into wisdom. So thanks for bracing through the winds and lusts in this video. And I hope to see you in the next installment of this video series where we explore Canto 6 and the gluttonous. So take care.